So in the last lesson, what we did was add our required attributes to our form fields. Now in a more complex application, we have also discussed the ability to add more attributes to our inputs to get any kind of validation that we want, as long as it is a valid format. So anything that the web browser supports, Angular also supports. Now what we want to do in this lesson is start to talk about validation and showing some error messages depending on our validation states. Now what do we mean firstly by validation states? By inspecting element, we get a glimpse of what's happening. We can see these ng pristine, invalid, touched. If we then add some content, you can see that we now have touched, dirty, and valid. Now before we go any further, we're going to take this lesson and start to understand what this in fact means. So first thing is we have our form. We have these properties such as valid. We have false. Before we dive too deep into this, we're going to change this back to form.value. Now what I'm going to tell you now is quite important. We have our form, which the form can be valid as a whole. For the form to be valid, each input must also be valid. So there are in fact two levels of validation that we need to perform, or at least think about. So when a user is jumping into our application and starts filling out all of the details, we can then start to reflect in the UI whether they've done this correctly or not. And this is typically done via a validation message. So what do we mean by having a validation state per input? So this is the way that I like to think about it. If we have provided the correct format and the correct setup for all of our inputs, then our form is then going to be valid for us. Because remember, we can change this over to valid. We can then hit save. If we then start adding some details, we can choose an option, we can add a price, we can select a promo, and then add some content. You can see that we now have true. So we can use this form.valid as a way to then allow the user to submit. Before we get there, we want to then provide a step-by-step validation for each of our inputs and their input types. So let's go and learn how to do exactly that. Let's start from our name. Now we've mentioned this idea of a template reference variable, and what we're doing here is binding an ng model. So what if we want to get access to this ng model to then see whether the input is in fact valid, invalid, and so forth? So what we can do is introduce the concept of a template reference variable. We can export a reference to our ng model by using hash name. So this is where template reference variables are quite interesting, because let's just say hash name and then log this out here. We will then see object HTML input element. So if we then change this over to value, as we then start typing, we then see this value being reflected. If we go and say name.valid, first off, we're going to see an error. Property valid does not exist on type HTML input element. This isn't actually very helpful. But what if we were able to get a reference to our ng model? So this is where template reference variables are very powerful, because we can supply what we want to export. Because we're binding an ng model here, we can say, actually, I'd quite like to know what's happening in this ng model, and please just export it for me under this name. So if we then go and undo these changes and save things out, we then get something different. We then see object. Now if we say name.value, start typing, this is in fact using the Angular ng model. It's not using input.value as such. We're actually wrapping things in ng model. So why have we ended up here? If we now decide to name.valid, we then get false. If we then supply some details, you can see as we add and remove, we're then toggling between this false and true. So what are the states and why am I showing you this? Now let's just add this inside of a p tag, and I'm going to show you a few different states that we can pay attention to. So we can have valid, we can have invalid, we can have touched, we can also have untouched. There's a couple more that we want to examine as well. We can have pristine, and we can also have dirty. So these are just some of the very common properties that we may want to use that Angular is keeping track for us behind the scenes with this ng model directive. So if I go and start typing, a lot of these then start changing. If we hit refresh, they reset. We have false, true, true, false. If we then focus and then leave, you can see that true and false have now swapped around. So what in fact are these? One by one, let's examine. I think valid is quite self-explanatory. When we land on our form, the field is of course invalid because we've not supplied any details. So therefore, valid is false, which means that invalid is then true. So depending on how we want to access these properties, we might want to use invalid or valid. More importantly, we have touched. What does touched mean? You can see that it's false by default. If we then go and focus and then leave, it becomes true. So that is the user then touching that particular input. And then clearly untouched does the exact same, but the opposite. So here we have untouched as true. If we then focus and blur, we then end up with true and false. So those values have been swapped. Now pristine and dirty are quite interesting as well. You can see that when we refresh, we can focus and change, and these do not actually change. However, if we go and add a character, you can see that those are then swapped around. Now the interesting thing is if we undo that, it's not in fact going to change. So what pristine means is that it's basically pristine. It means that it has not been touched before. When something has been made as dirty, a value has then been entered. Even if we undo the change, that form field is still considered dirty. So what we essentially want to do is learn how to tie these in to our validation messages. I think this is a great idea to just show you this in its own video. We've now examined this idea of exporting our ng model as a template reference variable. We've then looked at some of the common properties: valid, invalid, touched, untouched, pristine, and dirty. So we're then in the next lesson going to dive in and start styling our inputs and also providing some error messages based on these particular properties. This is how we then learn how to provide some validation in Angular. So let's dive in, start creating some error messages and styling our inputs when they become invalid, because at the moment we don't get any feedback of what's happening. If we were to enter some data and then remove the data, it's not really helping the user understand that they've perhaps made a mistake.